Nancy Pelosi is set to visit Taiwan during her Asia tour, a visit which some people are saying might trigger World War III. Chinese President Xi Jinping warned the United States that this Taiwan visit was akin to playing with fire. The Chinese military made a post on Chinese social media, quote, "preparing for war," a post which racked up 300,000 likes in 12 hours. Why is Pelosi's visit such a big deal? What's so contentious about Taiwan? To answer these questions, we're going to need to go over some basic history. Taiwan has been a part of China for centuries. People from the Chinese mainland sailed across the Taiwan Strait as early as the 12th century. For a while, Taiwan was part of Fujian Province, the mainland province closest to Taiwan, before becoming its own Chinese province in 1886. In 1895, China loses the Sino-Japanese War and is forced to turn over Taiwan to the Japanese Empire. Taiwan exists as a Japanese colony called Formosa for the next 50 years, until the collapse of the Japanese Empire in 1945 at the end of World War II. Taiwan was set to return to China, but at the time, China itself lacked a unified government. There was a civil war in China between the Chinese nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong. When Chiang Kai-shek loses, his nationalist forces retreat from the mainland and set themselves up in Taiwan. This is when the Taiwan issue begins. Unwilling to accept that they lost the war, Chiang Kai-shek self-declares completely ridiculously from this small island of Taiwan that he represents the real government of China, what he calls the Republic of China. At this point, the Communist Party controls all of mainland China, where 540 million people live. To any rational person, regardless of ideology, it's obvious that this is the new government. But the United States, eager to undermine communism, goes along with this absurd claim and backs up Chiang Kai-shek and refuses to recognize the new communist government. The US then uses its superpower status to coerce other countries into recognizing Taiwan, and even gave Taiwan China's seat at the UN Security Council instead of the actual government in Beijing. This would be like if the Confederacy, after losing their secessionist war, decided that instead of surrendering and re-entering the Union, they would retreat all of their forces to an island off of Florida and declare themselves the new seat of the US government, and then have all their pro-Confederate allies like Britain send diplomats and weapons to them and refuse to recognize Washington, D.C. Do you think people here would accept that? But the most egregious part of all of this is that the United States abandoned this absurd position and signed an agreement saying so in 1972. The Shanghai Communique, the treaty that ends over 20 years of severed diplomatic ties between the US and China, recognizes that Taiwan is part of China. This was such a core issue that there was no scenario under which China would have agreed to reopening diplomatic relations without the US recognizing this basic aspect of China's sovereignty. And the thing is, even the nationalists in Taiwan recognize that Taiwan is part of China. So is China overreacting to Nancy Pelosi's trip? Ever since 1979, no US head of state and no leader of the ruling party has ever visited Taiwan. No Taiwanese leader has come to Washington in decades either. So at a time when US-China relations are the tensest they've been in decades, for the US to send the third-ranking political leader to Taiwan, likely to meet with leaders of the government they don't formally recognize in defiance of the government they do recognize, is going to be seen as breaking their own treaty. China's calling it a strategic-level provocation. This is not some minor issue to them. So why is the US doing this? It's because the rise of China threatens the US's status as the sole world empire. They want to weaken, intimidate, or as crazy as it sounds, overthrow the Chinese government. It's part of a larger strategy of great power conflict, which is to step-by-step put China under total pressure, with tariffs, sanctions, bringing huge amounts of US naval power around the mainland, instigating separatist movements, and political instability. The US isn't seeking a head-on confrontation with the enormous Chinese military, but these sorts of measures climb the escalation ladder, which make an accident that could trigger something like that all the more likely. So the question for us is, who exactly asked Nancy Pelosi to do this? Where are the droves of people clamoring for the US to incite war against China? Nancy Pelosi tried to justify her trip, saying it's about security. But if Congress really cared about security, they would be addressing inflation, healthcare, or climate change instead of dragging us into World War III.